Because of its length, this lecture has been split into two parts. This second part will focus specifically on issues relating to racial and ethnic discrimination as they impact the U.S. justice system. Let's start with a well-studied phenomenon. You've probably all heard the phrase driving while black or driving while brown. Since pretty much the invention of cars and traffic enforcement, minority motorists have been complaining that they get stopped and pulled over by police more often than Caucasian white drivers, even when they are obeying all traffic laws. There is a lot of research that bears this perception out. An analysis of data collected by local police departments on millions of traffic stops over the past several years and published by ABC News shows that black drivers were between 3 to 5 times more likely to be stopped by police compared to white drivers in several major U.S. cities, even after accounting for the demographics of the cities and the counties those police departments serve. The exact number depended on the city. For example, black motorists were 5 times more likely to be stopped in Minneapolis and 3 times more likely in LA or Philadelphia. Houston was actually one major city where, in this data set at least, blacks and whites were stopped at equivalent rates. However, some disparities did still remain. ABC's data found that black drivers in Houston, as well as other cities, who were stopped were more likely to be subjected to searches of their cars or their bodies compared to white drivers who were stopped. Well, some say, maybe the police aren't pulling these drivers over because of what they look like. Maybe they were doing something they shouldn't have been doing, acting suspicious or speeding. These things would provide police with what we call probable cause or reasonable suspicion to make the stop. But if that were the case, we'd expect searches of black drivers' cars to be more likely to yield something called contraband. Contraband is a fancy term for something you aren't supposed to have, like drugs or illegal weapons. In fact, though, black drivers in this research, and other large studies, were no more likely to have contraband when compared to stopped whites. In some cases, they were even less likely to be found with contraband like drugs or weapons or some other kind of thing than white drivers were. It isn't just African Americans who are affected by this either. Two other recent studies looked at the impact of this on other racial and ethnic groups. Researchers at Texas A&M, for example, found that Hispanics and Latinos, out of all racial and ethnic groups in the state, were most likely to be searched during a traffic stop, even though they were not more necessarily likely to be pulled over. In this dataset, white drivers were actually the most likely to be found with contraband. Hispanic drivers who were found with contraband, though, were more likely to be arrested for having it when compared to whites. An analysis of traffic stops in Washington state found that Native American motorists were 5 times more likely to be stopped than whites. Blacks, Latinos, and Pacific Islanders had elevated rates here as well, replicating other studies. Again, though, stops of whites were statistically more likely to yield contraband or drugs than stops of other motorists. This doesn't just affect motorists either. So-called stop and frisk policies empower police to stop and question people if they feel there is a, quote, reasonable suspicion that that person is engaging in criminal activity. Police may then perform a frisk or pat-down search of their bodies or clothes if they reasonably believe that person may be armed or dangerous. Stop and frisk policies are controversial because the legal bar for reasonable suspicion may, in practice, be low, and because racial and ethnic minorities tend to get stopped and searched disproportionate to their population share. An analysis of pedestrian stops in New York City, for example, found that black men were stopped at about 8 times the rate of white men. Hispanic men also faced elevated risk. However, black men were the least likely to be found with contraband of all groups. The so-called hit rate refers to the percentage of times a police search discovers contraband. The hit rate for black men in this dataset was about 13%. The group with the highest hit rate, interestingly, was white women at about 20%. Now, that doesn't mean that 20% of white women in New York City are carrying drugs or guns at any given time. What it probably means is that for a white woman to be stopped and searched in the first place, she has to be acting pretty shady, whereas minority men complain of being frequently stopped and searched for no reason at all. Being stopped and detained has consequences even if you aren't arrested. It can make you late for work, your kid's school pickup, or other important obligations. It could lead to you losing your job. Traffic citations can lead to people losing their driver's license, another thing that can lead to job loss. It's humiliating, scary, and stressful, and it erodes people's trust in the police. Also, as we all know, some of those stops turn deadly. In 2016, 32-year-old Philando Castile was shot to death in front of his girlfriend and her 4-year-old daughter by a Minneapolis police officer during a traffic stop. The officer, Officer Yanez, reported that Castile and his girlfriend looked like, quote, people who were involved in a robbery, clarifying, the driver, he looks more like one of our suspects just because of the wide-set nose. I couldn't get a good look at the passenger. During the stop, Castile politely informed the officer that he had a gun in the car. Audio from the arrest records Yanez telling Castile not to reach for it, Castile and his girlfriend repeating that they weren't reaching for it, and Yanez yelling the same instructions several times before firing 7 shots into the occupied car. Later, Yanez stated that he had smelled marijuana inside the car, and it made him fear for his life. I thought I was going to die, he said in a later statement. And I thought, if he has the guts and the audacity to smoke marijuana in front of the 5-year-old girl and risk her lungs and her life by giving her secondhand smoke, and the front seat passenger doing the same thing, then what care does he give about me? Yanez was charged with second-degree manslaughter, but was acquitted. Yanez lost his job, though, and Castile's family and his surviving partner, Diamond Reynolds, settled a lawsuit against the city for $3.8 million. Records after Castile's death show that he had been pulled over at least 49 times in 13 years for minor traffic violations, most of which were dismissed. Castile's death at the hands of law enforcement, along with those of other Black and minority civilians, kicked off demonstrations in Minneapolis and all over the world, often under the umbrella of the social movement known as Black Lives Matter. We will talk about violence in law enforcement in more detail next. Philando Castile, unfortunately, was not alone. African American, Hispanic, and Native Americans are all more likely to be killed by police than are whites. The risk is highest for Black men, who are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police than white men. But Hispanic and Latino men faced elevated risk when compared to white men, and Black and Native American women had an elevated risk when compared to white women. Contrary to popular belief, this has generally improved over time rather than gotten worse, although we've seen a slight rise again in recent years since 2011. Police killings of young Black men in the late 1960s were about 5 times higher than they are now. But back then, before the rise of cell phones, the internet, and social media, such killings often got little to no media coverage. According to the Washington Post police shooting database, between January 1st of 2015 and the time of this recording, summer of 2022, 7,394 people in the United States were shot and killed by police. By the way, this particular database only tracks police shootings, not all civilian deaths at the hands of LEOs. Deaths like those of Eric Gardner in Staten Island in 2014 or George Floyd in Minneapolis in 2020, both killed after officers restrained and then suffocated or choked them to death, are not even included in these figures. The pie chart at the right shows total victims broken down by race. Caucasian whites, shown in dark blue, actually constitute the largest percentage of deaths, about 41%, but that's because whites are around 60% of the U.S. population. African Americans, shown in orange, who only make up about 13% of the United States population, are 22% of all shooting victims. Individual police shootings can vary widely in their details, so these data alone can't tell us much about the circumstances in which these deaths occurred. However, a study by Nix and colleagues in 2017 found that when minorities are killed, they are less likely to be armed or currently attacking the police when compared to whites who were shot and killed. Again, there are a wide range of circumstances that can lead to any single police shooting. So to get a better idea of the role that racial or ethnic bias might play in determining whether a police officer opts to draw their firearm and shoot in a threatening situation, some sociologists have designed simple lab experiments. What generally happens is they put people in a video simulator with a fake gun and flash pictures of both whites and minorities on the screen. The person on the screen is either holding a gun or not. Sometimes they might be paired with a neutral object, like a cell phone or a wallet. The person in the simulator is told to shoot if the person in the picture is holding a gun, and to hold their fire if he or she is not. Both civilians and police have been shown more likely to mistakenly shoot unarmed blacks and Latinos in these kinds of experiments. Civilians and cops both also take more mental time processing unarmed blacks as safe and to identify armed whites as a threat. So they were slower to shoot when it was an armed white subject, for example, as if quickly double-checking. One piece of good news, I guess, is that police made these kinds of mistakes less frequently than armed civilians, indicating that police training is playing some positive role. Most people, even most of the people in these studies, don't think of themselves as racist. If you straight up ask them if white people were better or more law-abiding than darker-skinned people, they'd say no. They'd be horrified at the suggestion. But that doesn't mean that these same people don't have what we call implicit biases. An implicit bias refers to prejudices or stereotypes that people may have and act on without meaning to or even being aware of them. You can want to be non-racist, but if all your life, your society, your family, your movies and TV have taught you to be frightened of young men of color, that fear may impact your behavior, sometimes without you even realizing it. Like I said, a lot of people think that police killings of civilians have gotten worse over time, and that's not necessarily true. In fact, data suggests the opposite. We just hear about it more now, in large part thanks to social media and the impact of social movements like Black Lives Matter. One past such case central to Houston history is this one. Jose, or Joe, Campos Torres was a 23-year-old Mexican-American veteran and a Houston native. On the night of May 5th, 1977, Campos Torres was arrested by HPD for disorderly conduct in an East End Houston bar. Rather than simply taking him into custody, the arresting officers beat him so severely that the jail supervisor refused to take him, insisting that the officers take him directly to the hospital instead. They didn't. Instead, they drove him to the Buffalo Bayou and tossed him into the water. 3 days later, his dead and severely beaten body was found floating there. A number of officers were implicated in Campos Torres' death. A rookie officer who was present testified for the prosecution, providing eyewitness testimony of the torture and murder of Campos Torres. 3 officers were fired, but 2 more, Terry Denson and Stephen Orlando, were eventually charged, though only of negligent homicide. When Denson and Orlando finally had their day in court, an all-white jury found them guilty, but only sentenced them with a year of probation each and a $1 fine. In 2021, HPD's chief of police formally apologized to Campos Torres' family, calling his death a straight-up murder. In 2022, Houston dedicated the Joe Campos Torres Memorial Plaza and Trail along Buffalo Bayou. Police shootings aren't the only place in the criminal justice system where we see evidence of some kind of inequality. Unfortunately, these disparities start at first contact with police and seem to perpetuate all the way up. At the time of this recording, the U.S. had the highest incarceration rate in the whole world, meaning we lock up more people as a percentage of our population size than any other country on Earth, between 640 and 700 per 100,000 in the population. Remember, the imprisonment rate controls for differences in population size. El Salvador is number 2, at 566 people incarcerated per 100,000 in the population. This is way outside the norm for wealthy countries, where the average is closer to 144 people per 100,000 in the population. In fact, our imprisoned population is so big, we have more total prisoners than any other country on Earth, even when compared to much more populated countries like India or China. Of all incarcerated people everywhere, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 are locked up right here in the United States. Our prison population also doesn't look like the United States at large. Some communities feel this more strongly than others. Racial and ethnic minorities make up only about 37% of the total U.S. population, but are over 60% of state and federal prison inmates. A black man is 6 times more likely to be imprisoned than a white one, and more than twice as likely as a Hispanic male. Native Americans also faced elevated incarceration risk. But why? Drug-related crimes aren't, by far, the only reason why people end up in prison. Only about 1 in 5 people in prison are there for a drug-related offense. Violent crime convictions are the most common reason people end up in prison. However, the so-called war on drugs, first declared by President Richard Nixon in 1971, brought with it increased enforcement and heightened penalties for drug possession that disproportionately targeted minorities. Therefore, it is one factor driving this trend, and one place where inequalities in the system are easiest to spot. Because racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to be arrested on drug charges, many people assume that racial and ethnic minorities, specifically African Americans, are more likely to use drugs than whites. But that's not true. The National Survey on Drug Abuse and Health is a large direct dial survey that polls respondents on a range of health behaviors, including drug use. Whites actually lead other groups with respect to illicit drug use, at least as of the time of these statistics. The first cluster of columns shows the percent of adult respondents reporting that they've used marijuana at least once at some point in their whole life. The second cluster has people reporting at least one lifetime use of powder cocaine, after that crack cocaine, then meth or methamphetamines. The first thing you might notice is that marijuana use is pretty common. 49% of all respondents over the age of 18 reported having tried it at least once. That is further broken down by race. Whites, shown in blue at the far left of each cluster of columns, followed by blacks in orange, Hispanics in gray, and Asians in gold. One thing you might notice for almost all of these substances is that whites are tending to report higher rates of drug use than other racial and ethnic groups, except in crack use, where black use is slightly higher, at 4.4% of the population, instead of whites' 4.1%. So, blacks are slightly more likely to use crack, but not that much more likely. Even a few years ago, blacks tended to self-report using marijuana at slightly higher rates than whites, but that's flipped within the last 5 years. If I had to hazard a guess as to why, it's probably that Democratic or blue states that legalized marijuana tend to be more heavily white, whereas states with larger black populations have still criminalized it. Whites may also be using marijuana more than they used to because they're more successful in getting prescriptions for medical cannabis compared to blacks. For most of the modern opioid epidemic, non-Hispanic whites also pulled ahead of other groups in their misuse of both prescription opioids like OxyContin and fentanyl, and street opioids like heroin, although of course prescription opioids like Oxy and fentanyl are also sold on the street. White users accounted for about 72% of overdose deaths in 2019, despite being under 60% of the population. This is part of what we call the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic refers to the dramatic spike in opioid use and addiction in the United States and elsewhere since the 1990s. During that decade, doctors began to prescribe more and more patients strong opioid painkillers, in part due to the introduction of new opioid medications, like Purdue Pharma's OxyContin, and marketing campaigns aimed at doctors, which attempted to reassure them that OxyContin's special time-release formulation made the risk of addiction low, and pushing since-discredited research that supposedly showed that people who were prescribed opioids by a doctor for legitimate pain were unlikely to experience true addiction. In fact, Oxy was incredibly potent, possibly even stronger than morphine, and more patients became addicted to it. Over time, as those patients were cut off by doctors or lost their jobs and health insurance, they turned to street opioids instead, including heroin, which has the same effects but is significantly cheaper. Recently, cheap but extremely powerful lab-manufactured drugs like fentanyl have begun to saturate street markets, leading to an unprecedented spike in overdose deaths. Fentanyl, which is similar to morphine but between 50 and 100 times more powerful, is particularly dangerous when it is added to other street drugs, ranging from meth to MDMA and even drugs like Adderall, and consumed without the user's knowledge. Though whites are more likely to use many illicit drugs, Black and Latino individuals face an elevated risk of being arrested or incarcerated on drug charges. For example, Black people make up only 13% of the U.S. population, but are 29% of those arrested for drug law violations. Latinos and Native Americans also face elevated risk, according to research published by the Drug Policy Alliance in 2018. Why does that happen? Part of it might be that there's increased police presence in minority neighborhoods, and minorities are more likely statistically to be stopped and searched. So even if they are less likely to be carrying contraband, those that do have it are more likely to get caught. Overt or implicit bias may also play a role in determining whether an officer lets someone go with a warning, for example, or takes them into custody. The structure of the laws themselves may also play a part. Early in the semester, we talked about the Anti Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and the stiffer penalties it imposed on crack possession compared to the possession of powder cocaine. Because crack was more likely to be used by poor minorities and powder cocaine by wealthy whites, white drug users were more likely to face lighter penalties and often no prison time at all, compared to black users who faced stiff minimum sentencing laws. As a result, between 1990 and 2010, black youth were arrested for drug crimes at more than double the rates of white youth, despite comparable use rates. This would be an example of conflict theory in action, wherein privileged groups may structure laws that, consciously or unconsciously, protect themselves and their own interest while punishing other groups. And so it continues. Once arrested and convicted, minority defendants are more likely to do prison time and more prison time than white defendants. A study published by the U.S. Sentencing Commission in 2017 compared sentencing length for male and female offenders of different races. Even when comparing for the same types of crimes, the Commission found that black men served longer sentences than white men. For example, for a white man and a black man both doing time on a burglary charge, the black offender will spend more time in prison. There are a lot of factors that determine how long a person's sentence can be, and not all are easily run through a multivariate regression. Past criminal record is a big one. To look at the effect of this, the USSC also looked at things like a past history of violent crimes. Still, they found a difference. Black men with no history of violent crimes still did more time for subsequent offenses than white men with similar histories. These data also found a gender bias, although in this case one that hurts men rather than women. Men of all races do significantly more time than do women, even when comparing for the severity of crimes. There are many factors that help to shape disparities in sentencing. Some are economic. A client who can afford to pay a better defense attorney might reasonably do better than one who is working with a court-appointed and massively overworked public defender. Others may be due to overt or implicit biases on the parts of prosecutors, judges, or juries. For example, a study by Starr et al. Found that federal prosecutors are twice as likely to charge African Americans with offenses that carry a mandatory minimum sentence than similarly situated whites. The fact that women do less time is likely heavily shaped by gender stereotypes. Judges and juries may simply perceive women as less threatening and more vulnerable. Even when they are charged with violent crimes, they may tend to assume or believe that if a woman has committed a crime, a man somewhere must have put her up to it. Since women are also more likely to be custodial parents, courts may err on the side of shorter sentences so that their children don't end up with relatives or in foster care. In the criminal justice system, not all victims are created equal either. One of the best predictors of harshness of sentencing, especially in the most serious cases, is not the race of the defendant themselves, but the race and gender of their victim. Defendants accused of killing white or female victims face harsher penalties at trial than those accused of killing non-whites or men. 75.6% of executions since 1970 were for the killings of white victims, even though whites make up only 45% of all homicide victims, according to the FBI. Homicide cases with female victims are more likely to result in a capital punishment as well, even though over 77% of homicide victims each year are male. It's not just the courts either. The term missing or murdered white girl syndrome refers to the fact that criminal cases involving white female victims get more media attention than those involving either men or people of color. At the time of this recording, more than 30% of missing women and girls in the United States are African Americans, even though African Americans make up only about 15% of the population. You don't tend to hear as much about these victims as you do about high-profile cases involving white women and girls, like Gabby Petito, for example, who was murdered by her partner in 2021. Media coverage is important. The more press coverage a case gets, the higher its likelihood of being solved. For this reason, activists in many communities have begun doing work to try to bring awareness to cases involving male and minority victims. Rolisha Rudd, for example, was 8 years old when she disappeared in Washington, D.C. in 2014. She has never been found. This kind of disparate treatment starts young. As a result of the war on drugs and the rising, terrifying trend of school shootings, many schools have enacted zero tolerance policies for student disciplinary issues. What that means is things that would have been punished by detentions in the past, like getting into fights or verbally threatening classmates, now result in schools immediately calling the police. School administrators do this because they're worried about legitimate threats to student safety. But it results in something researchers call the school to prison pipeline, because kids who act up in school are now more likely to end up in police custody and with a juvenile record. And time spent in the juvenile justice system is often the worst thing for a kid with a history of getting into trouble at school. The child is labeled as a bad kid, delinquent, or little thug by adults in their life or their peers, which often causes people to reject them or start treating them worse. The child misses school and so falls behind, increasing their chances of dropping out. Finally, exposure to other kids with juvenile records means a new peer group, and one that might encourage more bad behavior, like skipping school, using substances, stealing, fighting, and so on. All of these things can increase an individual's risk of aging into adult criminal activity later on. As with everything else we've covered, if you're a minority or low income, your odds of facing harsher school discipline are higher. Black children are 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school compared to white kids. A study conducted by the Council of State Governments on data from North Carolina, for example, found disparities in the implementation of the zero tolerance policies we talked about in the previous slide, mostly in relation to minor offenses. In North Carolina, black students were punished for the same minor offenses, usually cell phone violations, dress code violations, disruptive behavior, cutting up in class, and display of affection, kissing or hugging in the hall, by more than 15% for each category of offense compared to white students. In 2013, a researcher by the name of Lance Hannon and his colleagues set out to study the effect of something we call colorism on the treatment of kids in school. Colorism refers to the unequal treatment of members of the same racial group based on skin tone. This happens in mainstream culture all the time. Light-skinned black actors, for example, have an easier time getting cast in Hollywood movies than equally talented, darker-skinned peers. It can also happen within communities or even within families. If grandma seems to favor her lighter-skinned grandkids, for example, or alternately, when a light-skinned child gets teased or picked on by her darker-skinned cousins for looking quote-unquote too white. Hannon and his colleagues collected data on girls who'd been suspended from school and found that, even when comparing kids from the same families, darker-skinned black girls were more likely to experience harsher discipline from teachers and school administrators compared to lighter-skinned black girls. Disparate treatment of people accused or suspected of crime isn't the only place where we see an intersection between inequality and criminal justice. Hate or bias crimes refer to crimes usually involving violence or sometimes vandalism or property damage, which are motivated by prejudice on the basis of race, religion, gender or gender identity, sexual orientation, or some other status. In 2020, the FBI reported a total of 8,263 hate crime incidents in the whole country for the preceding year, but that's a major undercount. Most hate crimes don't ever get reported unless the crime itself is very severe. Hate crimes tend to follow patterns. For example, they tend to increase during election cycles. This is likely because some politicians will single out minority groups, painting them as convenient scapegoats for more complex problems. Then candidate Donald Trump, for example, blamed crime on undocumented immigrants, alleging that Mexico was sending its, quote, murderers and rapists, despite the fact that immigrants, undocumented or otherwise, actually commit crimes at lower levels than the native born. Certain groups may also be targeted because they are associated with frightening events. Anti-Asian bias crimes increased by 77% between 2019 and 2020, as some Americans, again partially motivated by political rhetoric, blamed them for the COVID-19 pandemic. Following the 9/11 attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C., Muslim, Middle Eastern, and even Sikh and Hindu communities in the United States also experienced an intensification of hate and bias crime activity. The fact that whites are less likely to face certain kinds of bad outcomes, from being rejected for housing to getting pulled over and searched by police or suspended from school, are all examples of what we call white privilege. White privilege is one of those ideas that ends up being divisive because some people think it means, oh, I guess white people get everything they want and their lives are easy. That's not what that means because it isn't true. What it means is that, as a white person, your skin color is less likely to count against you in any given social interaction. You can still face a ton of obstacles between you and what you want, but as a member of the majority group, your skin color, your accent, your religion, your nationality, or whatever, is less likely to be one of them. Less likely doesn't mean impossible. It can still happen that someone will treat you worse because you're white. You may also find that certain opportunities are closed to you. A job that serves Spanish-speaking populations might be easier for a native Spanish speaker to get, for example. Some institutions, like schools, may also practice so-called affirmative action and will make an effort to diversify their student bodies. Overall, though, the data pretty clearly tell us that light skin is an asset more often than not. The cartoon at the left depicts something sometimes called shopping while black, wherein minorities complain of being followed or observed more closely in stores than their white peers. The continued presence of racial inequality also means that minority parents have to prepare their children to deal with a very different world, and one that is often more dangerous. Following the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012, a number of black journalists, authors, and academics came forward about something they called the Black Male Code, which is a series of instructions parents of minority children, especially sons, must teach in order to keep their children safe. These largely involved questions of how to stay safe during contact with law enforcement and other authorities. Jesse Washington, a journalist for ESPN, wrote of the lessons he learned and those he teaches his own children. Always pay close attention to your surroundings, son, especially if you are in an affluent neighborhood where black folks are few. Understand that even though you are not a criminal, some people might assume you are, especially if you are wearing certain clothes. And never argue with police, but protect your dignity and take pride in humility. When confronted by someone with a badge or a gun, do not flee, fight, or put your hands anywhere other than up. Please don't assume, son, that all white people view you as a threat. America is better than that. Suspicion and bitterness can imprison you, but as a black male, you must go above and beyond to show strangers what kind of person you really are. By the way, this isn't a picture of Jesse Washington. This is John Crawford III, who was shot to death in a Walmart on August 15, 2014, after police saw him carrying a non-fatal toy BB gun he'd picked off one of the shelves in the toy section. Of course, it's not only men of color who need this information, or something people necessarily have any control over, no matter how they behave. The March 13th, 2020 death of 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, shown here, is a good example. Taylor was asleep when Louisville, Kentucky police launched a botched drug raid on the apartment she shared with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. Taylor was hit and died of her injuries after police began firing blindly into the apartment. No drugs were found as a result of the raid. So what does all this have to do with families? Well, discrimination in hiring, housing, education, and law enforcement perpetuate family inequality and the cycle of poverty, two things we talked about at length during the last lecture. Remember, the cycle of poverty refers to a set of factors and events by which poverty, once started, is likely to continue unless there is outside intervention. It can also refer to the higher risk of intergenerational poverty. The stresses associated with poverty and discrimination affect families in other ways, by leading to family breakdowns. Marriages among blacks and interracial couples are more likely to end in divorce than those among whites. And the higher imprisonment rates for men of color are also hypothesized to lead to shortages of marriageable men in those communities, something the Chairlin reading goes into in a little bit more detail.